Hello, and welcome back to our series where we are creating a people and culture management system. This series is brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jake Finger, founder and principal consultant of Prairie HR Solutions. And in this video, I would like to create a spinner. If you haven't watched our previous videos, I suggest you do so. We created this from scratch, and our last video, we started populating this. I went ahead and finished this, and this is a fictitious company. It's randomized data, and you can see that we have some HR work to do. Um, I know if you're in the finance industry, you're probably sweating like I am right now because you have some work to do. But besides that, um, it's become readily apparent with all the things that are happening in the background, populating this chart, running these formulas, putting it in the appropriate fields, that it takes quite a bit. So we'll refresh this, you'll see exactly what I mean. So you'll see it's 3 seconds pops up. And then if we select a division or a job title, it's about 2 to 3 seconds before it actually updates things. So when you have something that takes a bit of time, now keep in mind that this is before we went through and tried to clean up our code or optimize it, speed it up or whatnot. But when you have functions that take a bit of time to load and finish, you run the risk of the user um, going crazy. I call it button push happy. They just start pushing buttons. And unfortunately, when they push a button, they start overwriting other codes and things like that. So what we want to do is essentially slow them down and kind of tell them, okay, pause, we're working on it. Give us a second, cool the horses, wait for it to finish, and then do something else. And that is where the concept of a spinner comes in. Now, we've seen spinners. They're little spinny things that when it's loading, it'll either do a spin. Sometimes they grow. I've seen like a bunny bouncing around a tree. It just gives the user something to do or look at and notifies them, hey, we're working on this. Just give us a second and it'll be done in a sec. So what this video is going to be about is we are going to create a spinner. Now, we already created the functionality of a spinner because really all all a spinner is an HTML element, a div. And what that div does is it either shows or it doesn't show. It's always there. It's either set to block or none. And we can do that the same exact way that we did with our sections here. So we have the functionality, we just need to have the div. Now, a lot of times that little spinner piece is built into CSS to create the actual animation of it spinning. We used a front end toolkit for this, and then we used Bootstrap. So let's go over to Bootstrap and see what they have for spinners. Okay, list group. Nope, that's not what we're looking for. So let's come up here to the top and find spinners. Probably not, well, maybe customize. Nope. Won't be layout. We are going to need Z index, and we'll get into Z index here in a second. Right now, we're just looking for spinners. There we go. So let's see what kind of spinners they built in. Now, there's a limitation with a front end toolkit. You essentially use what they give you. They've done all the work for you, but you're kind of initially at least restricted to what it is that they have produced for you. So it looks like if we just want to use a straight custom spinner, they have this little border spinner. It kind of spins. And okay, then you can make them color. Remember, they have their little color scheme. Okay, interesting. So it looks like they're not using the border color. They're actually using this text color thing. Okay, so if we want to change the color, we'll have to figure that out. Okay, they have a growing, and then they make it align. Ooh, size. Okay, so let's just grab this real quick, and we'll pull this over here to our code. And where we're going to want this code is kind of outside of everything. So we can put it in between this total rewards information container thing and before the comp analysis section block can get toggled to block or none. So let's just put it right here. And what this is going to do is if we save this and then come back over here to our page and refresh it, you'll see, there we go. We have a nice little spinner there. And what we would like is that spinner to be here in the middle. So let's go back over here to our bootstrap code and figure out what that is. Now I'd like to do this deflex. So let's just grab this and wrap it in a display flex and put it in justify content center. Then we'll need to close out that div. So let's come back over here to our code. We'll put that right here. Let's actually spinner. There we go. So now we're going to need a closing div, and this closing div is going to be for the flex. So that's it right there. So now if we save this and then come back, this should now be over here in the middle. And it is. Now you'll see that it's actually taking up space. It's kind of shoving itself in between these lines. Maybe make it a little bigger, maybe, I don't know, 5 REM instead of 3. But we don't want that. What we would like this to do is to be on top of all this and then maybe have this grayed out to where people can't touch it. And they can't start mashing buttons all haphazardly like, and it won't take up space because it'll be sitting on top of that. And we can create what's called an overlay. And it's just like it sounds. It lays over our document. And we can put that overlay, we can put this spinner inside that overlay and have this overlay take up this entire screen. So let's do that. Let's create an overlay, put this div, put this little spinnery thingy in it, and then maybe give a maybe an opaqueness to that overlay, a semi-transparent. We'll set it to black, but we'll make it so transparent, maybe half, 0.5 would do it, to where this is darkened, and we won't have to disable anything because the overlay will take over the entire div, so they can't actually get behind it. So let me show you what I mean. Let's go back over here to our code. So what we can do is take this entire thing, and let's just give it a class that we are going to make up, we're going to create, and let's call that an overlay. And then let's give this overlay an ID. Let's call this spinner overlay. And then we'll close that out. And we'll change this to 5. Now what we need to do in order to get this overlay, let's go back here and I'll show you. It didn't really do anything other than, make it bigger, but it's still taking up space. So what we need to do is we need to stylize this overlay to ensure that it is actually pulled up off of this and functions exactly like an overlay. So let's kind of come back over here and let's look back up here at this Z index. So what the Z index is we'll come down here actually. This may have a better description. Yep, here it is. Okay, so this is the concept of a Z index. So a Z index 0 is the page that you're currently looking at. Now, if you wanted something to go behind that, then you would do ZN1. On top of it, one level would be 1. On top of that would be 2. On top of that would be 3. And if you come up here, it kind of tells you where they place their like modals, their tooltips, their toes, popovers, all that. This is their Z index. So if you had a backdrop modal and a modal, this modal would be on top of this backdrop if they were called at the same time. So that's kind of what this is. And we've already done this. We did this, I can't remember which. Oh, we did this when we made our zoom to full screen for our chart. We used 9999. And what that means is that there's nothing that's going to be above it. It is always going to be there. So we may need to change that because what we want is the spinner to be on top of everything. So we can change that later. But what we need to do is give that overlay a Z index of something to make sure that it's above everything here. So let's do that by coming over here to our code. And what we're going to need to do is jump into our CSS file. Now, we didn't create a special file for this. We're still using this operations CSS. So let's come down here to the very bottom and let's create an overlay. Now, remember that we gave that div a class of overlay. So what we need to do is use this period. And you'll see here we go. We have this Z index. I'm going to put this at 998 just to ensure that our overlay overlaps it. And we need to call that class that we created overlay. Selected is what it's called. And then we need to give it some CSS styling. The first thing we need to do is make sure its position is fixed. Now, this isn't going to be a CSS tutorial. Again, as always, if you want me to put together a CSS tutorial, I'll be more than happy to do so. But for now, I'm going to be very kind of direct. Now, you'll see that this chart container here, this position is relative to its parent. And what that is doing is making sure that chart stays kind of the same size inside that container when it zooms in and out. For this, we just want it fixed because it's going to take up the whole thing. And let's give it a top and a left margin. That's how far over, how much room is between the top of the screen and the left of the screen, and we don't want any. So we need to give it a top margin of 0, a left margin of 0, and that'll push it all the way over to the end. And then we need to give it a width and a height. So if it's all the way up here and all the way over to the left, all the way up to the top, we then need to give it a width and a height. And since we want to have it take up the entire screen or viewport, whatever the viewport is, we want it to be 100%. And the same with the height. Let's set that at 100%. And let's focus on the background now, the background of this thing. So let's do just RGB, and we'll set that RGB to black. So straight black is this. So let's save this and actually see where we're at right now. Come back over here, refresh it. Now we're going to have an overlay, and the overlay is going to be pure black. Now we haven't done a Z index, so this stuff here is still on top. Because remember, by default, Bootstrap has certain things that are above it. So all of this stuff here, these containers, are above Z0 just by default. But it's black. We don't really want that. We want to give it some sort of semi-transparent property. So we can do that by taking this RGBA or RGB and turning it into an RGBA. And then we can continue on this path to where this is RGB, and we need an A, an attribute here, a transparency. And we said we were going to try 0.5. And then what we need to do is I know we have justify content in there already. as center as well as the display flex. But I'm not sure if we're ever going to run into problems. If we're going to run into problems with Bootstrap CSS in the future. So what I would like to do is just call that as a default. So let's set the display to flex. It's not going to override anything, but if Bootstrap ever changes, then we will now have something to fall back on, and it just, it may act a little weird, but it's not going to stop working. Because that's the other problem when we're using, it's not a problem, but that's the other thing we got to be aware of when we're using a front-end toolkit or any library, is those libraries could change. And if they change enough to where a lot of your code's not valid anymore, or they change something within their library that doesn't work with what you have anymore, then you can run into issues. So the last thing we want to do is set this Z index. So what this Z index is going to be is maxed out. We're going to max that thing out to, regardless of whatever is going on, this overlay is always going to be on top. So let's save this here. And I suppose we could use this, but I don't want it to take up the entire screen. We'll just leave it at 100% right now. This is viewer, viewport width, viewport height. We don't want it to take up like their toolbar up here or anything like that. We're not going full screen. Okay, so we saved it. Let's go back over here and refresh and see what we got. Let's see if that transparency's not too dark, not too thin. Okay, perfect. I think this is good. Now, notice that we didn't actually disable any of these fields. People just can't access it because right now they're trying to click through the overlay that's taking up this entire container here. And as you can see, there's a border around it, and that border is that overlay. So in order to get to this, they'd have to go somehow around the overlay and then down. So that's good. Now let's make sure that it scrolls, and it should. And see, there we go. Perfect. So now we can continue stylizing this, making it, colors or whatever, but let's right now actually get to the functionality piece. So right now, this is set to block. What we should do is actually set this to none so we can turn it on and off. So let's do that. Let's come back over here to our code, and we could do it here, I guess. We could do it here, or we could do it inline. Since we're already here, let's go ahead and just do it. Let's just make the overlay set to none. No, because we haven't actually done this here. We'll do it inline. So let's come back over here to this code and our total reward page. Let's go down here to our overlay. Okay, good. So what we want to do is we want to set this overlay piece here, this complete overlay, style is equal to display none. Now what that did was it completely ensured that our overlay is not visible and it doesn't take up space. It's still there. It just is kind of hidden and doesn't take up space. But we can toggle that with our JavaScript. So now let's come back over here to our code. And what we're going to need to do is to create a function that actually turns this style display from none to block. And all we are going to need is this ID. So let's come down here to our total rewards.js and let's scroll all the way down here. We're going to need to do basically this. What we're going to do is we are going to use an if statement to check if it's set for, we're going to check to see if it's set for block. If it is, we're going to set it to none. And if it's set to none, then we want to set it to block. So let's create this controlling function, and let's call this spinner control. And what we're going to need to do is to grab that spinner by its ID and store it in a variable. So let's call that variable spinner. It's going to be document.get element by ID, and that ID, let's make sure I got it, spinner overlay. And we store that into a variable. Now what we can do is run an if statement. If spinner style display, because that's what we're checking, is strictly equal to none. Word to the wise, always check none first, because you can get into functionality issues to where if the default is set to block, then it's going to try and be block, and it's going to read block, so it won't work quite as well. So always check, just word of advice, always start with the default being none, and you're checking none. And if it is none, we want to set that spinner style display simply to block. And then let's give it a else, and if it's not set, then we just want to leave it as none. None. There we go. So now what this is going to actually enable us to do is to call this function anytime that we want to run something. And we want to run it the first time, like right out of the bat, right out of the gate, as soon as this page starts loading. Now, one thing that we're going to have to remember, though, is this is not actually shutting anything off, because all it's doing is setting it to none. So let's save this. We're going to have to do some more work to this. But let's come back here to our total rewards page and figure out when we want this to actually run. So we would like it to run right when our page loads. So this is the very first thing that starts happening when the page pops up, is all these things. So what we can do is let's just add it right here. We may need to change it. Spinner control. So now what should happen here is after it runs this fetch, data, draw a chart, initialize options, and all this stuff, it's going to run the spinner control. So let's see the timing of that. Come over here, make sure we saved. We didn't. Let me save this real quick. There we go. Let's refresh this. Okay, so it's running, but it's running up here. So that's kind of odd as to why it's running up here and not scrolling down. It's up here in the nav bar. I mean, it's there. So let's come back over here to our CSS. We may need to close that out. And then what I did was I commented out the Flex Content Center. And what we may do is do something a little different. Okay, so it's there. Let's refresh it again and see what happens. Okay, nope, still doing it. But it's populating, so that's good. So instead of that, let's actually think about where else here we can put this. for now, let's come back down here, and instead of running it here, because this runs essentially all the time, instead of here, let's actually run it in our process data. So we're going to put it right here in our process data, or what we could do is just simply add this as a DOM load. So let's try that. Make sure it's saved here. Okay, nothing, but I'm curious. There it goes. Okay, so we'll have to figure out what this is doing. We'll have to work on that later. Okay. So it's firing. So what we need to do is figure out exactly when it needs to fire. And what we're going to do with that is, instead of having it run in our header, well, first let's figure out exactly what's going on with this thing. Because it shouldn't be up at the very, very top. It should be up. So let's find it again. Here it is. Let's actually take off this piece here and then see where it's actually going to populate. Okay, it's populating up here still for some unknown reason. Content center. Let's look at our CSS and figure out what in the world is happening here. So there's our overlay. So our overlay is fixed, but what we need to do, okay, so I see what's happening here. So what we need to do is, this is our overlay. What we actually need to do now is one for our spinner. So our spinner needs to have its piece. So we've created one for our overlay, and that overlay has all of this center stuff. But now what we need to do is create one for our spinner piece here. So let's go back here and find out where our spinner here is. So what we actually need to do is do the same exact thing as our spinner overlay, except for our spinner border. So we need to add in and ensure that this border here is actually, this spinner is inside the overlay. So to do that, sorry, I was lost in thought there for a second. Just trying to make sure that I was getting this correct. Let's create another spinner. Spinner border is what that class is. And what we're going to need to do is, that spinner border is centered. The align items is centered, but it's way up here at the top. So what we need to do is just pull it down. And we can do that by isolating the spinner and doing this also as fixed. And from the top, we want 50%. From the left, we want 50%. Now remember, this is 50% of this overlay. Because what it was doing is, it was going all the way up to the top, which was this, and it was justifying the content center and aligning the items in the center, on and on. So let's see, we did it at 50, 50. Let's see, this should this should take care of it. Let's see. Let's save it, and we'll come back over here to our page, and we'll refresh it. And yep, there we go. Now it's back in the middle. Perfect. So now what we can do is come back over here and let's figure out a place that we need to call our function here, this spinner control function when it loads. And then let's figure out a way real quick to get it to shut off. So let's actually put it in our, for now, just for demonstrations, let's put it in our comp filter. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we are going to want to run this spinner control here. And now we need a way to shut this thing off. And we can either do it by, we can set up certain items and techniques called promises, but that's a little bit out of scope for what we're trying to do. We could set a timeout. So let's set that timeout on our function here. Set the timeout here. So let's go down here to our function. So essentially, we're going to run this if statement here. And what we're going to want to do is ensure that it gets set, it goes away when after a certain amount of time. Now, JavaScript reads time not as hours, minutes, days, or whatever. It reads it in milliseconds. So any time that we give it has to be in milliseconds. We've done this in a previous video, so if you want more in depth, please go back and look at that. So we're going to set a timeout. We'll use our arrow function. And what we're going to need to do is the function that we're going to want to run is setting this to none. Is going to equal, simply none. So that's what we want this function to do, and we need to give it a timeout. So let's actually use, just default it to 3 seconds. Now remember, this is milliseconds, so that's 3,000 milliseconds. So that should give it enough time for it to run. And then what we can do is we can also come up here. We have it set for this comp division, but what we can do is come up here and the second that it runs DOM comp loaded, we can then put spinner control here as well. Okay, so let's save this and then see what we got. We may have to do a little bit of fine tuning down the road, but at least the concept should be good. Okay, so let's refresh this. It should automatically close it out. Let's wait for it to fire, if it's going to fire. Okay, it doesn't look like it's liking that com, but we did this division, so let's see. Okay, good, the division works. Let's make sure that it comes out here. Okay, so it's not shutting off. So let's go see why. Okay, so we're setting the spinner. Oh, we're setting the spinner overlay to that. So that should close that. And it's not. arrow here. So let's open up our F12 and see what is actually happening here. Okay. Set time is not defined. Set time is not defined. Okay, so that's the problem right there. It's not set time, it's set time out. It's that. Yep, opening up that console log in F12 or logging things out in Google Apps Script will really help when you're trying to debug. Okay, so now we saved it, corrected it. So now, yep, we'll have to figure out a way to do that here. We can figure that out in the next video once we do a little bit more styling. So it fires it, and in 3 seconds, it should stop it, and it does. Perfect. So now it's fully functional. This next video, we will work on styling that little circle, as well as adding it into the second that it's fired. We're going to have to just do a DOM, an event listener. When the DOM's uploaded, we'll just fire that thing off. And then also do the same thing for job title. And then we should have a fully functional spinner. So thank you for joining us for this episode. I hope it was informational. And if it was, please hit that subscribe button. Let us know that this is the type of content that we should continue on. If you do have ideas of things that you would like to know, please drop us an email. Our email is in that description box. And until next time, please take care.